Hello and welcome to the Council of Engineering and Scientific Society Executives Best Practices for Creating a Member Engagement Scoring Model. To start off, we have a few announcements. Registration is open for our upcoming event for CES members, Developing Your Leadership 2021 Game Plan for CEOs and their Board of Directors. We also are running a Member Get a Member campaign to recruit new CES members. If you refer a new member, your name will be put into a drawing to receive a $250 prize. Now back to the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If during the presentation you have any questions or difficulties, please use the Q&A function in your menu items to alert us. We will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation. All attendees can download the handouts for this webinar by selecting the handouts option in your menu items. Today's webinar is being recorded and a link will be posted on the webinar library online after the presentation. After the webinar is over, please complete the survey you received via email. Also, join the membership SIG right after this webinar in a happy hour discussion and hear what your society peers are doing with their member engagement. Today's webinar is being presented by Bill Conforti, the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Solutions at Association Analytics, where he works closely with clients and prospects, as well as product development and delivery teams to keep Acumen and our related services aligned with the needs of association professionals looking to make better, faster, data-informed decisions. Bill has more than 20 years of experience leading technology companies in business intelligence, software development, and consulting. And with that, I'll be turning it over to you, Bill.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for having me, everybody. Just a few quick things. I've been doing this a long time, a little over 20 years in technology, products and services overall, 6 years with Association Analytics as part of the executive team. And during that time, I have spent a lot of time working with clients and prospects, as well as with our product development and delivery teams. And a lot of that is keeping aligned with where we're going with our product and the services around that. So I also do a lot of strategic consulting with clients, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. That includes our engagement workshops. It includes broader data and analytics strategy, and it also includes some data governance. So let's jump into what is one of my favorite topics to talk about. It's member engagement or customer engagement, and then specifically how we're going to score that. So we talk a lot about engagement. We know why it's important. We know when we see it. We might even have some examples. But what's a good definition of engagement? So it can be different for every organization, right? The activities that are important for your organization are certainly going to be different from another. And we're going to talk a lot about those, throughout the next hour. But also it's not just about the activities. It's about motivations. It's about sentiment. So why do members choose the activities they do? And what does that say about their relationship with your organization? So when we talk about engagement, we talk about and we think about an exchange of value. And so to illustrate that, let's take a look at some of these personas here. So think of a value continuum where on one extreme, on the left side, the member gets all the value. And on the other side, the association or the org gets all the value. So on the left, we have the guy, the persona, the bargain hunter, right? So this guy only cares about price. He joined because there was a promotion or an event bundle. He probably is not going to renew, and he doesn't really have any particular loyalty to your brand or to your mission or anything like that. The on-demand type member really only engages when they're needed, like maybe when their CEUs are about to expire or they want to submit an abstract to attend or to speak at your upcoming conference. If there's an opportunity to drop membership in between those things, they'll definitely take advantage of it. Now, on the other side, we have some other types of members like the mentor, right? And you might call them something different, right? But every organization has members like this. They're mission driven. They're senior leaders. Maybe they're in the retired or lifetime status. They're great for the brand. They're promoters, but really they're not as active as they once were, either in their careers or really in their membership with the organization. And then there's those autopilots, right? So every association has some have more than others, but there's always a lot of members that renew their engagement, renew their membership year after year, but they're not really engaged any other way. And you kind of wonder really what's in it for them. Like, why do they continue to do that? So in the center, where there's kind of this balance, between the value that the individual gets and the value that the organization gets, are what we call the profitable promoters, right? And these members are highly engaged, they're mission driven, they value the products and services that you provide, and they're really in it for the value, not the rate, right? It's not about price, it's about value for them, right? And they're doing these things for their careers, but it's also about advancing the association and the overall profession. And very often they also happen to spend the most money with the organization, right? So here's that exchange of value, right? So again, we have on the left side, people that are making decisions based on price. They're members only when it's necessary. They're passive and they're kind of disengaged. The other side, they're also passive, but for a different reason, right? They may join and they may stay members because it's expected or their company pays and things like that. And what you really want are members that are sticky, right? They're loyal, they are mission driven, they look at value, they're advocates for your brand, and they're highly engaged, right? And they also, again, tend to be your top spenders. And so transitioning that and extending that to the idea of scoring, what people always ask me is, what does engagement score really tell you, right? What question does it answer? And it's interesting because really it's not an answer to a specific question, but it's part of the answer to all of your questions, or at least many of your questions. And so the way I like to think of it is, if you had an engagement scoring model that allowed you to quickly identify members and customers that were in the middle of that continuum, right? Those profitable promoters, how would that change how you do certain things, right? How would that change how you choose volunteers or committee members, or how you market to your meeting prospects? How would that change how you solicit donations, from different segments of your membership or your audience? What about selecting award winners or even nominees, right? How would that change how you promote your products and services, right? If you really could look at categories or types of products and services and look at who's engaging in those activities and why. So that's really what we're here to talk about, right? I mean, you're going to use that engagement score to find all of these things, donors and leaders and volunteers. And so how do we do that? And the answer is engagement scoring. And fortunately, we can do that in 3 easy steps. And so we're going to dive into each one of those steps here in the next half hour or so. Choose activities, right? First, we have to choose what it is that we want to measure. Next is assign weights. So we have to decide the relative importance of each one of those things. And third, we have to calculate the scores. So now's a good time to mention, one of the things that kind of underlies all of this is that engagement scoring requires a lot of data. So the more data you have, the more robust your scoring model can be, and the more precise and more accurate your overall scores can be. And so you do need some way to collect and aggregate data on all these kinds of activities that we're going to be talking about. So, if you have that question, well, this sounds great, Bill, but I don't have all of this data. It's not that uncommon. Engagement scoring in 3 easy and 1 not so easy step was not as catchy of a title. So we're kind of assuming that you have the data part figure out, but I do want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be perfect, right? So there are tools, right? Acumen being one of them, that integrates and aggregates data from various sources and has built-in engagement scoring and things like that. But you definitely can start small. You can start with spreadsheets. That's where most organizations do. And you can expand your model and your scoring methodology over time. All right, so with that, let's dive into the first step, which is choose our activities. So we know, we know that engagement is important, right? And there are many reasons why we want to choose certain types of activities, but for the most part, they kind of fall into 3 buckets. So first are the ones that drive operational outcomes, right? So these are the biggest ones, the transactional things that lead to revenue. These are renewals, meeting attendance, and purchases, things like that. In the middle are the customer experience, right? So this is, it improves your relationship with customers and members, right? So these are things that tell you whether your content is relevant, whether your members and customers are loyal. It could be things like continuing education. It could be things like free webinars, right? Do they take advantage of those kinds of things that you offer? do they open your emails at a high rate, or do they ignore them? And then there's a third category, which is a bit broader, and those are things related to your strategic objectives. And so, one thing is, very often a strategic objective can be just like very generically to improve member engagement, but that one is, it's not as measurable or as specific as it could be. But think about other sort of less tangible or less measurable type of objectives that you see in strategic plans all the time, right? So things like you want to solidify your organization's position as a thought leader, right? You want to be the go-to authoritative source on certain topics within your field, or just very generally, you want to elevate the profession. And there are services, there are products, there are things that you offer, that speak to all three of those things, and do your members and do your customers consume them in the way that you want them and the way you expect them to. Okay, so a few sample activities. We're talking a lot about activities here, and one thing I should mention, I think most organizations that are represented today have individuals as members, but member and customer engagement is also for organizations. There are activities that organizations can do, and you should care about them, and you should try to measure them in largely the same way that we do things that are relative to individuals. So just as some examples, membership activities are important, right? We want prospects to join, and we want our members to renew. Attendance at meetings, right? We want them to attend our events, right? And this is a big part of the revenue picture, for most organizations. Donations, right? We care about maybe how often, people donate. We certainly care about the amounts that they donate. We have a lot of content that we want them to read. We want them to learn. Do they consume it? Do they browse our website? Do they download our newsletters? Or do they subscribe to our newsletters? Do they download our content, read our blogs, etc.? On the marketing side, right? Do they open the emails that we send? And do they buy things, right? So purchases and just general amounts, like do they spend a lot with our organization? I mean, that's a pretty basic, statistic and pretty basic metric of how engaged I am with the association. But it's one that shouldn't be left out completely either. Okay. So what else is important about choosing our activities? We have to make them measurable. So when we're talking about measurable, we're talking about three things. So first are counts. So oftentimes, we care about how many times the member or the customer has done a certain thing, an activity, right? How many times have they attended an event? How many times have they volunteered, etc. For amounts, we're really talking about dollars. So we're nonprofits, but we still care a lot about money, right? We need to run our businesses, and so we care about things like the amount of purchases, within a specific category, the dollar amount of donations or other things, and then rates. So with rates, we're talking about how frequently did a member or customer do X activity compared to their peers, and most often this is used for things like email statistics or maybe web traffic. Okay, so counts, amounts, and rates. Those are the things that we can measure. Now that we're kind of got an idea for the types of things that we want to choose, next question we get very often is how many? And the short answer is between 6 and 10. And how do you know that between 6 and 10 is the right answer? It's because we've done this a lot. And if they're less than 6, it usually means that there's a problem with collecting or accessing data, right? And so if you're just getting started and you really only have reliable data on a few key metrics, then you definitely can start with 6, but with less than 6, but over time, you're going to want to build that up and cover some more ground with your, activities. If you have more than 10, it's very likely that you have some activities that overlap, and you have some things, that could be combined, right? And so if you look at the sample engagement on the left, there's a lot of very small sections in that chart, and generally speaking, that is bad for a lot of reasons. And we really don't want a lot of small sections, and we're going to talk about that a lot more in our next section. next section, which is step 2, assign the weights. Okay. You guys remember this? Remember this guy? He was the one that got up real early and he said it's time to make the donuts. Right. So when we talk about assigning weights, that's really what we're doing. So we looked at some donut charts in the previous slide, and so we're going to talk through kind of how we get the right donut for your organization here. That is what we do in those engagement workshops that I mentioned at the beginning. It's something that involved key stakeholders from across your association. It's usually about 90 minutes, maybe a little bit more. And essentially what we do is we first start with a long list of all the different possible activities, that could be included in engagement score. And then we go through and we combine them into buckets. And then we start to get at what are the relative importance of each one of those activity types. And most times, choosing the activities is the easy part, coming up with that long list, but paring the list down and getting consensus on how to weight the items on that list, can require some conversation and some negotiation, between the business areas. So one thing I want to do is I use the word points sometimes, right? And you can see on some of the materials we'll use the word points, and it's really called a score, and score and points kind of go together. But really you should think of it more as weight, right? Because we're kind of calculating what's essentially most like a weighted average, right? And so we want to make sure that we're weighting things accordingly and not just counting things that are not the same, right? So we don't want attending an annual conference to count the same as clicking an email, for example, right? So let's dive into that a little bit. Okay, engagement score 185. Is that good or bad? Well, we don't know, right? Is the short answer. If it's 185 out of 200, that's pretty awesome. If it's 185 out of 1,000, then we might be looking at an at-risk member, right? They're doing some things that we want them to do, but really clearly not enough, right? And if we look at it, 3 community posts, right? So is that 3 community posts in their lifetime, or is that 3 posts this week, right? That says something much different about this particular member, right? And were those meetings, were those 5 annual conferences or 5 free webinars, right? Because we know that a lot of organizations count webinars and networking events and things like that as meetings, and unless you've separated those out, you could run into problems by doing that. And so this, basically what we're looking at is kind of some of the issues with what we call open-ended or point-based systems, right? And another one is that the ranges in these systems are arbitrary, right? And so if we look at this one, our same member here, they have a score of 185, and let's just look at some of the things that were part of their profile, right? So for donations, right, they had 50 points for donations. And so what does 50 points mean? How do we know it's 50 and not 60 or 100 or whatever? And usually when we see that, the association has gone through a process of creating some ranges, and they would look something like this, like, $1 to $100 in donations gets 5 points, up to $249 gets 20, up to 500 gets 50, and then more than 500 gets 100 points, right? And likewise with events, 1 or 2 events is 10, 4 events is 50, and if you attended 5 or more, then you get 100 points, for your events. And so the problem with ranges like these are, they're quite arbitrary, right? And so is someone that donated $250 really 2.5 times more engaged than someone who donated $249 or $240 or even $200 for that matter, right? And is going to 5 meetings really worth twice more than going to 4? Not to mention that if I add anything, to this list, then I'm effectively diluting, the value that I intended to ascribe to all of the other activities. So thinking about all of those things is kind of what led, me and Association Analytics to the model that we're describing today, which is used in our Acumen product. So, to summarize, open point-based systems, they lack context, right? So this is, that idea of 185. It's not really clear whether that's a good or bad. So we want something that is in context, that's normalized, and that's standardized. Second, the ranges are arbitrary, so we want to avoid using ranges like that where we have to kind of choose a cutoff point where there's like a big cliff or a big dip, between values that are very similar to each other. And then last one is that new activities dilute the results. So all of these things are kind of what we had in mind when we decided how the process should work, for how you weight those activities and how you ultimately create the donuts, right? So let's look at that. Okay, the donuts. How do we make them, right? So the first thing is we measure what matters, right? So the engagement score should measure things that connect to the strategic plan, and they demonstrate that two-way exchange of value that we talked about. So next is we want to group similar activities, right? So we talked about we don't want to group things together that are not similar. Like in the previous example, we talked about one person that had gone to multiple annual conferences and the other person that had gone to multiple free, 1 hour long webinars. We want to make sure that we're counting those things in the same buckets, right? So we want to count, my webinar attendance versus yours, and we want to count my annual conference attendance versus yours. We don't want to, but we don't want to compare webinar attendance with annual conference, right? So the total should equal 100, and so it's not really important that it equal exactly 100, but it is important that it be standardized and that it be something that's easily recognizable, right? And it just makes sense for it to be 100. That's what we're all used to with our grades, from back in school. When we think about weights, they're very often and usefully looked at as percentages. So for a lot of reasons, it makes sense to make your donut 100. And so that every activity, the sum of all the activities that you include in your donut have to equal 100, right? So we also don't have that problem with diluting because if I add 10% for one activity, I have to find somewhere to subtract 10% from something else, right? So when I look at my overall donut, it's very clear what are the things that I consider a highly engaged member to be desirable, and which things are not as important. Okay, so counts versus amounts. So that means that we can track both how many times someone does something or an organization does something, and we can also track the dollar amounts, and you can look at them separately, right? So donations is a great example, right? If pretty much everyone donates the same amount, like it's for many associations, the biggest and most common way to donate is to add $10 or add $50 or $100 to your membership application. And if you do that, then you end up with a lot of people, of course, that don't donate at all. But of those that do, almost all of them donate $100, right? And so the amount of the donation is maybe not as important in that case as the number of times that they do that. Do they check that box year after year or not? Whereas others, you might have someone that donates a large amount every couple of years or something, and that's something that you want to make sure that you're keeping track of. Last thing is limit small weights, and we're gonna look at the reasons for that. But basically, if you're looking at a lot of different activities that are less than, say, 5% of your total, then you have to at some point ask yourself if those should be in the model at all. And if they are, then very often it's going to be something that is that's a yes or no, right? They either get all the 5 points, the 5%, that section, or they don't get any. And so we'll look at that a little bit more in the next section where we talk about calculating scores. Okay, so we talked a lot about choosing our activities, and we talked about how we can weight them and come up with this donut. that that you're going to use to measure engagement. And so what I want to do is I want to show a donut for a CES member. This is the Water Environment Federation. And what we're looking at here is a model point distribution that includes several things. So I'm not going to go through every slice or every section of the donut, but I do want to talk, in general about what they're doing here. So first of all, you can see that they have a couple of pretty big sections and a few smaller sections, that are 5 to 7.5%. I think overall this is a pretty good distribution. They do have 3 small sections. I might like to limit that to 2, but overall, they have approximately the right number of sections, and there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of thought put into how each one of these things are weighted. We have a section for just purchases, right? So what that does is if you have a section for purchases, then that means you really don't have to be worried about the dollar amounts that are spent in any of the sections individually. You can just count things and then look at spending overall as kind of its own category, right? They did a good job of bucketing their different meeting types, so that we're counting things that are similar. They wanted to put a premium on volunteers, right? So people that were committee members that had offices or leadership positions within their committees. They also cared about those that volunteered to be speakers or moderators at conferences. And so all of that went into creating their point distribution model. And one thing I would say is that this is not necessarily set in stone. So one of the other things that's important about your model, and that's an important element of what we do, with our models and with our clients, is we allow flexibility, meaning that if you want to change it, if you want to add a section to your donut, or if you want to change the weights of any of the things that are included in your donut, then you definitely can do that. And what's very cool about it is your engagement score is then recalculated historically over time, so that you have this really cool curve, for how the member engagement has been increasing or decreasing over time, and it's always in the right context of today's model, right? So we'll take another look at how that looks in the last section, where we're going to talk about calculating our scores, right? Okay. So now, we've chosen our activities, right? We've gone through an engagement workshop, right? Whether it's held internally or whether it's with the assistance of some consultant to help you work through that, but the result is that we have a working list of activities, and then we have assigned them weights, right? So we know relatively which ones are the most important and which ones are not as important for our overall engagement picture. And we feel comfortable with that because we know that we can always change that if we find that the model that we come up with doesn't seem to accurately reflect what we perceive as the most engaged members, right? So that's kind of the basic litmus test that we do, is we validate this by saying, look, apply your model, use the math to score everyone, but then kind of take a look, right? Every association, the membership and the marketing people, or the advocacy people, in some associations, the meetings people, right? They know who are the most engaged members, right? They know who are the ones, we'd like to have more members like X or Y, and if those members are at the top of your list, right, then it's clear that you've done a pretty good job with your model. If you don't find them at the top of your list, or even worse, if you find them at the bottom, then it's probably your model's not really accurately reflecting the engagement of your members. So anyway, so you have your weights, you have your activities, and you have this idea that you can be flexible with that. So next thing is to calculate the score. Okay. Now, so with our calculation, there's a couple of things here. One is, strongly recommend that each section, right? Each section represents an activity type, right? So this section where we have a weight of 30 or a 30% section, just for argument's sake, let's say that represents your event attendance, right? Your annual event attendance. And I strongly recommend that we separate and we score each one of these separately, so that a given member is going to have in section 1, they're going to have a score that's somewhere between 0 and 30, representing how much they've engaged in that activity. They'll have in section 2, right, the purple one, they'll have a score between 0 and 25, representing how much they've engaged in that activity. And so that's what that's going to allow you to do, is not just have one number. Again, right, remember the 185, that number is out of context, right? But even a number that's based on a 100-point scale can still be out of context with respect to any one activity, right? So if I have an engagement score of 85, that's pretty good on a 100-point scale, but that doesn't tell you how I've engaged in meetings versus how I've engaged with education versus how I've donated or participated in committees, right? So it's really important that that you understand not only what's my overall engagement score, but how do I perform and how is that reflected? How do I score in the areas that you care about most, right? So separate those sections, make sure that everything included in each section is similar, right? So we're counting like amounts and we're counting like activities, so that so those separations between the sections are meaningful. Okay, now the scores in each section are relative. Okay, so now we see up on the right hand corner, let's look at just our one section, right? So we have this section weighted as 30, right, which again represents our event attendance. And what we have within that section are deciles, and the deciles represent how engaged I am with respect to the entire population, right? So it's relative to everyone else. So it's not that if I attended 3 meetings, that's worth 40 points, and 2 meetings is worth 15 points or 25 points. The way it works is that if I am in the top decile, for meeting attendance across the entire population, then I get all of the points, right? And if I'm in the 7th decile, right, then I get 7/10 of the points, right? So the point is that I don't have to arbitrarily assign ranges. I don't have to arbitrarily assign points for any activity, whether it's a count or an amount. All we do is take the entire population and then we score my contribution relative to everyone else in the population. And that's a solid way of doing it. It's the best way that we've found so far. It's always in context of your overall population, so you're always looking at a relevant view of my participation within that particular activity. Okay, so now this is where it gets I don't know, maybe a little bit more complicated. Here we're talking about scoring by section, right? And so let's talk about a few things that we've looked at so far. So first of all is the weight, right? So we talked about building the donuts, right? And each section of your donut, corresponds to a weight. And we know that the sum of all of our weights, should equal 100. And we also know that if we add a section or if we delete a section, that's going to affect, the relative values of everything else, okay? So the weight effectively is the maximum score, for that category, right? So in this case, the maximum for that section of our donut is 30. Okay, now next is the activity decile, right? And so if you remember from the previous slide, we showed which is effectively a bar chart, and each bar represents 1/10 of the population, and they're split, so that I can be rated or scored, relative to everyone else in the population for that particular activity, right? So no activity is a 0, but then deciles 1 through 10, get a percentage of the section score, that corresponds to that decile, right? So the first decile would get 3 in the case of a section that's weighted as 30. The 4th decile would get 12, the 9th decile 27, the 10th 30, right? So it's clear, how we get how we get the maximum score within that section, right? So if we talked about an activity decile of 9, so I'm not quite in the top, but I'm very close to it, then I might get 27 out of 30 when it comes to when it comes to that particular section. Okay, and so we kind of rinse and repeat, for each section, and the sum of all of that is our engagement score on a 100-point scale. Okay, so this is a look at what's called an individual engagement profile. It's from our product called Acumen. And what I want to do is kind of dive into this a little bit and show you some of the key things that we are meaning to convey, with this visualization. So, first of all is what is the overall engagement score, for this customer or for this member, right? So that's up in your top left. We can see this is an individual that has a 95. They're one of our most highly engaged members. How does it compare with all our other customers, right? So this one, right, their score is so high that that they're near the top, right? But we don't necessarily have anyone that has 100, so 95 is in the 98th percentile relative to everyone else in our population. In which areas is this member or is this customer highly engaged, right? In this case, they're pretty highly engaged across all of the different sections in our model, but if you have one that's a little less, homogeneous, right? Maybe they have some that are really big, some that are really small, and you might wonder, that members that are highly engaged in one area, you might expect them to be highly engaged in another, and if you don't see that, then that's something that you can identify as a marketing opportunity, or something that could be improved, right? How is engagement trending over time, right? So on the right here, we have a look at the engagement score trends over time, and the exact window of time is not really the point here. The point is to look at, are we improving, yes or no, when it comes to our engagement with that member or that customer. And for the most part, this one has been high, most of the time, but there's some dips and valleys, and that's kind of reflected in what we see below, which is the subcategory score trending. And what this shows you is it's really interesting, because what we're really looking at is the composition of the engagement score for that particular member as it changes over time. So this type of chart is called a ribbon, and the way ribbons are organized is that the largest value is always shown on top, and so the order of those different colors is, it conveys which one which one has the highest value. And so at certain points, what was the highest value at the beginning, it kind of dipped down a little bit and then eventually came back up. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, but ultimately what you're really looking at here is what are the things that members value the most, and how is that reflected in your your products, your services, your content, things like that. Okay, so now we've kind of looked at the 3 steps, right, which are decide on your activities, right, decide how you want to weight them, add up all the sections until you get an engagement score, until you can look at that relative to your overall population. You can look at the trends in those scores over time. And there's a couple of other key things that I want to cover, which are kind of important to really doing this effectively and doing it at scale. So let's not forget about these key things. The first one is interval. And so what is the right time to, what's the right time frame to measure your engagement activities, right? And we get asked this question a lot. Very often, engagement score is something that's looked at either in a time frame that is forever, like anything that you've ever done, and it's just cumulative over time. And so the longer you've been a member, the higher your engagement score becomes, and that tends not to be very useful. We've also seen some models that look at a 1-year period, right? And so that's something that I've done today is worth the maximum amount for 365 days. And then on day 366, it becomes worth 0, right? And so there's a lot of problems with, with those kinds of ranges too. It's not just score ranges, date ranges like that are also can be problematic. So, so to cut to the chase a bit, the right answer to this question for us is 3 years, right? And so 1 is definitely too short, and 5 is definitely too long, for most activities. And really the answer, the question that you have to ask is how long does that activity remain relevant, right? And so, if I donated money, especially if it was a large amount, even if it was 3 or 4 or years ago, that's something that might still be, or 2 or 3 years might be something that still be relevant for you. So next is decay. So most of the activities that I can do, or that a member or customer can do, they grow less relevant to you over time, right? Their value decays. And so, the event that I attended, 3 years ago doesn't say nearly as much about my engagement with the association as the event that I attended last month, right? So the value decays over time. There are mathematical models, for how you can implement decay, but for most purposes, something simple is going to work best. And so so what we use is linear decay. It's pretty simple to understand, and it's pretty simple to implement, right? So looking at our interval, which is 3 years or 36 months, what we do in terms of decay is we take 1/36 of the value, right, which is again the weight times the activity decile, and we decay that over 36 months, right? So it's 1/36 per month over that 36 month until it finally drops off of your engagement score altogether. Now this one we kind of learned the hard way, and there's some things that that grow over time, they don't decay. And so think about a committee membership, right, or a committee chairmanship, something like that. And if I joined the committee and became the chairman, or I had a leadership position, and I started that 3 years ago, that's really something that actually becomes more valuable over time. So the value of that doesn't decay, but it actually reflects a higher level of engagement for the longer that I hold that position, right? Or maybe you want to count months of continuous membership, or something like that, right? So things that build over time. So those don't decay, so we don't necessarily want to apply our rules about decay to those. So we want to think about the interval. We definitely want to account for the value of engagement activities that decay over time, and also we want to also consider things that grow. Okay, getting to the end here, I want to look at some key takeaways. So the first one is start with the data you have, right? So again, there are products, right? Acumen, being one of them. They're very good at integrating and aggregating data. Acumen happens to have a scoring model already built in, that allows you to get a lot of what I've talked about right out of the box, but you don't necessarily have to do that, right? So most important thing is to start now, right? If you're not doing engagement scoring already, it's something that you need to be doing, right? You realize that, or you probably wouldn't be watching today. But the message here is that if you wait for perfect or even complete data before you start measuring engagement, you may never get started, right? So it's much more valuable to start with what you have today and then resolve to improve that over time. So next is measure what matters. I want you to be deliberate about how you choose that activities, right? Think about making sure that they are measurable, right? The counts and amounts and rates that we talked about, and be deliberate about the things that sort of make the cut, right? Again, the easy part is making that long list of all the things that might be included. It's a little bit more of a challenge to really go through, and considering all of the different key business areas within the association and making sure that everybody's input, is accurately reflected in what becomes, the standard engagement score across the association. And I guess I should make the point here that we're talking about engagement in the macro sense, in a way, right? So there might be other things that you would measure on a micro scale, like an engagement with a particular form or within your website, you know, or that's something that's targeted towards a very specific type of conversion, right? So more like engagement, what we mean in the micro format, like we're talking about engagement to get a purchase or something like that, you know, but we're talking about in the broader sense, right? Measuring what matters to indicate that larger value with the association. Next is standardize your scale. So you can choose any standard scale you want, but for simplicity, really strongly encourage a 100-point scale. It makes things very easy to understand. If the person that develops your engagement scoring model leaves your association for any reason, the next person that comes in is going to find it very easy to understand a 100-point scale and the relative weights that's involved there. So highly recommend that. Not last, but no arbitrary ranges. This means measure everything relative to your population, right? So again, you know, that idea that, you know, someone that donates $100 is you know, 5 times less engaged than someone that donates $200, right? That's not really what you want, and you know, especially near those cutoff points with those ranges can be a big problem. Lastly, don't forget about decay, don't forget about growth, and don't forget to choose an interval to calculate and to look at for your engagement scoring that makes sense. So my strong recommendation here is to start with 3 years. And I don't recommend going shorter than 3 years. If you really feel like you need to go longer, then that's something that you could do. But you know, having done this a bunch of times, most of the time we find that it's not necessarily the right thing to do. Okay, so I want to give you a couple of resources. First of all, email me anytime. As I said, this is something I'm very happy to talk about, and be more than happy to point anyone on the on the webinar today in the right direction. You know, kind of starting from wherever you are, and you know, recommending how you can get to where you need to be. So yeah, so you can email me bconforti@associationanalytics.com. So next thing is on the QR code there, getting started with member engagement. This is an ebook. It's available on our website. You can get there with the code that's provided, and it covers a lot of what we talked about today. You can share this with others on your senior leadership team, and get some buy-in for really taking something like this on if you haven't done that already. And the other one I included, kind of for today's audience, I think a lot of you will be interested in. This is a very recent study that we did with McKinley Advisors. It's really talking about how associations are using data to drive their strategy, right? And it's really relevant. There's some specific things for kind of the pandemic situation that we're in now. So there's some COVID-related questions and recommendations, but really this is applicable to any organization that wants to connect their strategic plan with their data. Yeah, and so that's it. Highly recommend that resource. Thank you so much for your time. Want to wish you good luck engaging your members and your customers. And I think I would be happy to take some of your questions now.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Bill. Like you said, we will now be opening up the session for questions. Please use the Q&A function on your menu to submit any questions you have at this time. We did have a few questions come in during the presentation. The first one we have is, how should you be investing in resources to look at individual engagement? For context, we are a medium-sized org, but have been growing rapidly. So we haven't really invested in a detailed engagement model or tracking.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the model itself is, I mean, it's for free, essentially, right? The main investment that you have to make, and probably, to be honest, it's an investment that you might already have made, right? So you have an AMS, most likely, right? You have to think about where your engagement data lives, right? So you have an AMS, which has a lot. You have a marketing automation system, most likely. You certainly have a website. You may have an online community. And so all of these, you have systems for tracking donations, event registrations, all of that. And so whether you use, a small number of systems to track that, or you have like a dedicated, key source system for each one, the idea is to get the data into a single place where you can then apply a model like, like what we've done here. So applying the model, it's, the hard part is really just to think of, the weights and choose the activities. The math, I mean, it's built into our platform, but it's, it's not as difficult as you would think to apply those calculations.
Thank you for that. Another question we had come in is, have you tracked engagement in an association election before?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. So I think the short answer is no. But depending on what that question means, if it's talking about participation in an election, then almost anything like that, can be tracked, and it can be part of your engagement model. Or on the flip side, if it's talking about using using engagement scoring to vet candidates or something like that, then that's something that's commonly done for for all types of leadership positions.
Thank you. Another question we had was, you mentioned how to account for decay, but how would you account for the growth?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for asking that. So I mean, the main way not to account for growth is just not to apply decay, meaning that if you talk about something that builds over time, when we're counting, like if you might count, for example, the number of months of continuous membership, right? And so for every month, that's going to increase naturally. And so you just don't apply any decay to that. And then the more months I've been a member continuously, then the higher my engagement score becomes. Likewise, for committee membership or something like that. Now, if you wanted to apply additional weight to that over time, so that the difference between month, say, 12 and 13 is a little bit different, or a little bit more than the difference between month 11 and 12, then that's something that that you could also apply mathematically. I don't know that I'd recommend that, but that's something that you definitely could do, and that would be a customization in our case, to the engagement model.
Thank you for that. Following back up on the question about the election, this member mentioned that it was about the participation in the election, but the ballot is kept anonymous. So is there any way to account for that in this sort of situation?
So I don't mean to seem like I'm dodging the question, but like with just about everything else, if there's a way to measure it, and if it exists in your data and can be brought into this central repository that we talked about, then it can be used for engagement scoring. However, one of the things that it requires is that it be attributable to an individual, right? So a lot of times we get questions about social media. It's like, well, can we look at social media engagement, for your member engagement score? And so then our next question is, well, do you know the social media profile, right? Do you know the handles and the profile for all of your members in social media? And the answer almost always is no. And so then it becomes something that you can really only look at in the aggregate, and it's still valuable, but it's just not part of my engagement score. It's just, what kind of participation did we get in the election, and what kind of sentiment and what kind of engagement do we have with our social media broadly, but not, how is Bill, individually engaged with those things.
Thank you for the clarification. The last question we have is, should we start now and only look forward, or should we be going back retroactively and looking at engagement holistically that way?
That's a great question, and I'm, if I was doing this presentation again, I would have covered that. So great question, whoever asked it. So I guess what I would say is, if you can, it's best to go back. And if that's a lot of effort, then it's definitely better to start from today forward than not to start at all. And so if you invest in a solution like Acumen or something similar, then one of the key values that system and that company is going to offer is to integrate those data sources, but also to kind of rebuild your historical data in a sense, right? So an AMS is really good at today's current values and counts and things, not as good at looking at that over time. But if you have years of transactions, right, and of orders and membership changes and things like that, then you can rebuild a lot of that activity going back over time. So if it's feasible for your organization to afford a solution like that, then you're essentially, you can get an engagement score today that includes the past 3 years of data without as much manual effort.
Thank you so much for that response. And thank you again, Bill, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar hosted by the Council of Engineering and Scientific Society Executives. This presentation will be available on the CES website as a recording at a later date. Please take a coffee break with us and join us at 3:15 Eastern Time for a membership SIG discussion. You can find that Zoom link to join in the CES community. For any more information on upcoming webinars, please visit ces.org or email info@ces.org. Have a great day and stay healthy, everyone.